Hi, I thought I would give you some extra information regarding this idea that in academic writing we should be using newer sources. Um, and I want to, first of all, you should be. That's standard academic practice, and I'm going to show you why. Um, but that's not necessarily saying that old sources are bad or even useless. But this is a graduate program, and we're doing graduate academic work, and uh, you should be using newer sources. And if an older source is appropriate, you should also have newer sources in that same paper. So students often wonder why newer sources? The Bible hasn't changed in 2,000 years. Why do we need newer sources? Well, let's talk about that a little. Let's talk about standing on top of the mountain, and I'll get to the mountain illustration in a moment. Adam and Eve left the garden knowing very little. I mean, look, tried to use fig leaves for clothes. That shows you how little they knew. They had no idea how to use very much of the world for their advantage. They didn't know how to pluck the little white thing off a stalk of cotton, turn the cotton into thread, the thread into cloth, the cloth into clothes. They just didn't know how to do it. And of course, God killed animals for them and whatever. That's beside the point right now. They knew very little. God probably told them some things to get them started, but by and large, they knew very little. They had no written language. They spoke. They didn't have a written language. They had no mathematics, no tools. They had to learn by doing, and humanity has had to learn by doing, following in their footsteps. And humans have learned a lot about every subject since Adam and Eve. So the common illustration was interesting. I was reading an article unrelated to this today, and I ran into this illustration. The common illustration is it's as though every time someone figures out a new piece of knowledge, comes to understand creation better, makes a new word, a new theory, a new mathematical formula, or new kinds of math, it's as though they made a little pebble. And all of humanity has been throwing these pebbles on a pile since Adam and Eve. That pile is now a huge mountain of knowledge. So our goal when we write an academic paper is to stand on top of the mountain, to be where, theoretically we know all the knowledge that humans have generated about the topic we're writing on. Now, nobody ever knows all that, but if you're writing if you're reading good top of the mountain sources, they are bringing you to that state of knowledge, even if you don't know everything that's underneath. So we want newer sources because we want to stand on top of the mountain. Now, in one of the discussions, a student said something like, old authors or new authors can be just as wrong as old authors, or old authors can be just as right as new authors. I've forgotten how it was put. Right and wrong isn't necessarily the issue here. We certainly want to be right. But the question is better informed or not better informed. And even in the areas of Bible and theology, we're throwing pebbles on the mountains every day, and we can be better informed. So if the Bible hasn't changed in 2,000 years, and theology is theology, what kind of biblical knowledge is new? Well, these designations, type 1, type 2, type 3, those are just my designations. This isn't something you can take other places and talk about type 1 biblical knowledge and people will know what you're talking about. This is just my designation. So type 1 of new biblical knowledge. It's knowledge that has to do with the meaning of the Bible and its historical context. Did I say that clearly enough? The meaning of the Bible in its historical context. Now, the sad fact is that knowledge of the ancient world disappeared in the Dark Ages, and we've been regathering those pebbles and putting them on the mountain ever since. And in the last 150 years, there has been a lot new about that. I'll give you some illustrations in a minute. Type 2 is permanent theological knowledge. Now, this is where we must be careful. One of the schools I attended, I have 5 degrees from 4 institutions. One of the schools I attended, I remember one of the professors saying, when it comes to theology, what's new is not true, and what's true is not new. And I sympathize with that statement. The Trinity, salvation by grace through faith, the deity of Christ, none of these things are changing. But there's a lot of detailed theological knowledge. There are the kinds of things good Christians have always disagreed on, and there's things we just haven't thought through well. And in the last 150 years, some of that has been clarified. Again, I'll give you illustrations in a minute. And then type 3, application to Christian lives. That is a form of biblical knowledge. What does this text mean I should do that must be renewed all the time? And I'm reading a book right now by a preacher from the 1800s, and he has tons of applications in it for carriage drivers and blacksmiths. And he's using those kind of illustrations, those applications. That needs to be renewed all the time. So let's look at some illustrations. Examples of type 1 knowledge, historical context. Ugarit. You've probably never heard of Ugarit. It was a city north of Israel in ancient times. It had been completely forgotten. No one knew anything about Ugarit until 1928. A farmer was plowing his field. He hit something. I don't know the whole story, but that led to digging. And what they uncovered was this incredibly well-preserved city with lots of written text in it. And the language of Ugarit was very similar to Hebrew. In fact, people who knew Hebrew could kind of figure it out, look at it and figure out what it was saying. It was that similar. What we knew about ancient Hebrew before 1928 was all in the Bible. That was the whole of ancient Hebrew literature. Now, this is not Hebrew literature, it's Ugaritic literature, but it gives us comparative literature to look at, and all sorts of things have been learned about the Hebrew language, Hebrew vocabulary, that have clarified the Old Testament. Now, they haven't revolutionized it and said, oh, the Old Testament didn't say what we thought it said, but they have increased our knowledge, and an expositor of the Old Testament is better informed if he knows about Ugarit and Ugaritic. And 1928 is actually very recent in terms of that kind of discovery, because it takes a time for that discovery to be examined, discussed, and to become common knowledge. So that in around 1980, when I was studying Hebrew, my professor was saying, oh, here's the stuff that's really cutting edge, you've got to get to know, and it was Ugaritic. And he just introduced it to us in, if I remember right, one class period. While I was talking today with a faculty member who's young enough to be my son, and he had a whole unit studying Ugaritic when he studied Hebrew. And that's just how knowledge has changed. And newer commentaries are going to know about that, older ones aren't. The Hittites. This is conservative Bible-believing folks' favorite illustration. The Bible mentions the Hittites several places. Between, about 1700 and 1900, lots of unbelieving critics say there is no record of the Hittites anywhere. The biblical authors made them up. See, it's fiction. And then in 1884, actually, I forget the story now, but a discovery was made of Hittite civilization. The center of their civilization is in what's now called Turkey. And between 1884 and 1906, the Hittite capital was excavated, and all sorts of stuff was learned about them. And about the same time, some Egyptian letters, correspondence, were unearthed in the Sinai Peninsula, also referring to the Hittites. And the Bible was verified, but not just verified, enlightened, so that when it talks about them, we know more about what they're talking about. Is that going to change your next evangelistic message? No, but it is going to make for a better commentary when those are mentioned. And then Roman social life. I know very little about this one. I just ran into this in something I was reading this week. But Roman social life was based around patrons and clients. Patrons were people of high status with a lot of money, and clients were people without status, without money, who depended on patrons to make connections for them, to buy their goods or arrange for other people to buy their goods. And basically, everybody that wasn't a slave, if they weren't a noble, they needed a patron who would look after them. Well, according to what I read this week, what has been learned since about 1970, that and FF means and following, 1970 and following, is that the language of Roman social life was the language Paul adopted to talk about salvation. When he talks about by grace through faith, grace is what was true of a patron, and faith or faithfulness is what was true of a client. Now, this is new enough that I don't even know how significant it is. And the people might make something out of it that I would disagree with. But it is new knowledge that illuminates the meaning of especially Paul's epistles in the New Testament. So, what about type 2 knowledge, theological knowledge that gets clarified? Well, most of the 20th century was a raging debate on the inerrancy of the Bible. And it, in my mind, culminated in the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy, which was a detailed statement signed by many evangelical scholars on what we mean by the Bible is inerrant. If many of these free commentaries were printed before that debate, and that doesn't mean they don't believe in inerrancy, but they hadn't worked through all of the details of the doctrine the way it has been in the last 100 years. And then here's the one that's still controversial: justification by faith, which was a doctrine, if you want to talk about things being new, it's not a new doctrine, it's in the Bible, but it was lost to the church and rediscovered by the reformers, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, in the 1500s, so that was new then. But now there's a thing, some scholars, notably a guy by the name of N.T. Wright, who are advocating a clarification of justification by faith based on their understanding of Paul. N.T. Wright says both the Reformers and the Catholic Church misunderstood Paul in ways. And it's not that he doesn't believe in justification by faith, but he thinks we can clarify it. I'm not sure if I agree with him or not, but it's out there and it's going on. A new commentary will address that information. Older ones won't. And then type 3 knowledge, application. And I'm running out of time, so I've got to be quick. Alcohol. When I was a kid, what I grew up with was Christians never touch any alcohol. That's how I lived my life. These days, most evangelical Christians I know say something like, drunkenness is wrong, alcohol isn't, it's all right to have alcohol in moderation. Don't know what you agree with, but that's different applications of that. And then what I think is a huge one for the church today is pornography. No one that takes the Bible seriously thinks pornography is okay. But the statistics say 70% of the men and 30% of the women in your church looked at pornography in the last month. What are we going to do about that? That's an application of the Bible we need to be working on that a modern commentary might well address, and I'll guarantee you a commentary from the 1800s won't. So, old commentaries, they may not be wrong, but they may be lacking historical information. They may not be wrong, but they do not know anything about current debates or theological issues. And they may not be wrong, but they probably know nothing about current issues of behavior. And that's why new sources.